Welcome to the Create a Movement podcast with your host, Ross Middleton.
Hey guys, what's up? Now we have an incredible interview lined up for you today. It is with a pastor by the name of Alan Platt. Pastor Alan birthed and built an incredible and enormous church by the thousands in South Africa that started in Pretoria and is now spread all over South Africa and now around the globe, called Doxa Deo. He also leads City Changers, which specifically specializes in catalyzing and leading city movements. And so his insights are incredible. His heart is amazing. So I hope and pray that you'll be challenged and encouraged in this last episode of the first season of the Create a Movement podcast. Enjoy. Welcome, everybody. Well, I'm sitting here with my friend, a pastor, a great pastor from South Africa with a beautiful accent named Alan Platt. Alan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much. What a joy to be with you. We actually always say you guys have the nice accent. So, I hail from South Africa. I have been a pastor basically all my life, although in the last few years of my life, the last 10 years, I have not directly pastored a local church, but rather led a movement called Doxa Deo. And that was church planting all across the world, which then spawned a ministry called City Changers Movement, where we actually help others to engage in becoming more missional.
Wow. So your church in Joburg, right?
Started in Pretoria, South
Pretoria,
Africa, where that was in 1992, and it grew into a typical multi-site church.
Yep.
And then we started reproducing in other cities. So we are in Joburg.
Okay.
We're also in 5 other cities in the nation. And then started planting out in London and Stuttgart and Auckland, New Zealand. And
Wow.
now we're finding ourselves kind of enjoying something of a global presence.
That's awesome. Well, that sounds like a whole nother interview I think that needs to happen at some point, hearing about all that. Well, tell me a little bit about how you ended up in South Florida from South Africa.
Well, it really is. I blame my friends. What happened was, as many of your listeners might be aware, there was a crisis that happened in one of the really large churches here in the Broward County. And one of my friends who was very close to that process invited me to a 2-day event where the new leader, Doug Sauder, who had just received this mandate to lead this very complex, large church for which he had not been prepared, the way that, we perhaps thought, but I know God had. They wanted to give him all the help he could get, and the idea was just to come for 2 days together with other key leaders in the U.S., sitting down with Doug and just having 2 days of questions and answers about leading complex church organizational processes.
So just for him to learn and kind of glean to help transition to a new role.
The idea was just to kind of have a 48-hour incubation of ideas and thoughts and communication, which when we were through, some of the leaders of the church came to me and said, could I give them 3 months of my life? That's exactly what I did. I laughed. I thought, man, I don't think that's going to be possible. But then in the divine providence of God, we figured it out. And so we came for 3 months.
Okay.
That was in 2015, January to March. Of course, I chose my months well in Florida.
It's a good time to be in South Florida.
And after the 3 months, they approached me and said, could you give us another month? And then it became another month. And ultimately, it became 6 months in that year.
Wow.
Which, of course, gave me the opportunity to really connect not only with Doug and the leaders of his own church, but with many of the other leaders in the region. And it was in that season that the thought was birthed that it seems that the area and the leaders are ready for something of a missional unity process to find expression.
Gotcha. So you came here for one reason and kind of ended up staying here for basically a completely different reason, essentially.
Right. We probably can't help ourselves, because that's really in our fundamental DNA to talk about what does it look like when we move from our ecosystem to a kingdom ecosystem.
Okay.
And really just challenging leaders to think beyond just their local responsibility.
Yeah.
And what does it look like if we galvanized our hearts and our minds and just our visionary expectation together. And of course, by the end of that year with Calvary Chapel, as I was navigating the journey with them, we had a few people here in the region that approached us and said, we know that you want to relocate the Doxa Deo City Changes program globally. If we helped you to do that, would you relocate to South Florida and give us some time of your life to help in the architecture of the Church United space?
Okay. So explain to me real quick, what exactly do you guys do with the Doxa Deo City Changers movement?
Well, really, City Changers is something that was birthed out of Doxa Deo. And just to give 2 steps back,
Okay.
When we started the ministry in 1992, we saw incredible growth of the church. And in 1994, I was deeply challenged as one day I was sitting in my study thanking God for the incredible growth of the church, the fact that people were coming to church. Since God was challenging me that I was celebrating an incomplete reality, that he not only wanted his people to come to church, but be equipped to leave the church, being sent, commissioned, and affecting their communities.
Yeah.
And so in that time, God started changing our vision from being a church for the church to becoming a church for the city. And everything we did from there really was asking the question, how could we affect our community, and how could we touch the spiritual, social, cultural reality of our city?
Okay.
And then many leaders started asking us what we were doing, and to facilitate that conversation, we created the City Changes movement. And so when I came to Florida, I did not come and hoist the flag for City Changes movement, but that's who I was. I couldn't help myself. So every conversation really was filled with what we would normally see as a City Changes movement initiative.
Okay.
But not to bring confusion within the ranks of the environment here, we did not make that public. We just served Church United.
It's more being the DNA and the heartbeat of who you are.
That was exactly it, yeah.
Okay. So we were just speaking right before we started recording. We were just speaking about kind of the beginning and the birth of Church United. So you were, obviously you're woven into the story of that. So from your perspective, how did it all begin?
Well, I joke often and say it depends who you speak to, because Church United was not, I think, started by any individual. It was a collective of various people coming together, converging at the same time with this heart. But what, from my perspective, happened was there were some significant role players in the region that came together and said, what if we just gathered together a quarterly basis? And it really was 6 leaders that started coming together and saying, how could we more effectively just serve and bless the process as it starts to evolve? And so behind the scenes, they played a role to help craft and empower some of the early initiatives, of which the first initiative that we had was to bring leaders together. Initially, about 12 leaders came together, where we just asked the question, how is your soul? Because of some of the challenges that had transpired in the region, with some leaders experiencing challenge in their lives. And so we challenged the leaders and said, how's your soul? What if we just came together and just talked to one another about health and living spiritually and soul healthy lives? That just kind of galvanized some of the leaders together. We went away for a retreat, where we had an overnight retreat with wives, and it was just amazing. And as we were about to leave the retreat, the question was asked, so how do we continue this conversation?
Now what?
And so we made a commitment at that stage that for, I think it was 9 months, we would come together once a month and spend a lunch and the whole afternoon to the evening just processing soul care dialogue. So initially, Church United did not really start just with a missional, what are we going to do together? It was more, let's just allow our hearts to blend together in a caring environment for one another as leaders.
Sure. It's awesome because a lot of times pastors are not the one that get asked the question, how are you actually doing? It's more focused on metrics and growth and all that kind of stuff and challenges along. So that's cool to hear. Well, tell me, Alan, as you've been around the world, I mean, you have a little bit of a unique perspective because you've been doing things with this whole kind of idea in mind of bringing together churches and ministries and pastors in other places, if I'm not mistaken. And so can you speak to a little bit about the ingredients that are necessary for something to take place on a larger scale?
Yeah, we are very privileged to have this similar conversation in various places here in the USA, but also in Europe, in Australasia, in South Africa, also in Brazil. And it's interesting that this is a global conversation right now.
Wow.
There is as if this is the time where the church is awakening to this understanding that for too long we have postured ourselves intentionally and sometimes just, because we get busy, against one another. And so we became very tribal, and in some ways we did not reflect well on kingdom life and engagement. And I think this is really dawning on the church all over the world. And so in different places in the world, we are finding it emerge with different initiatives. In other words, if we take the three concepts that have now become embedded in the Church United world: connect, collaborate, and celebrate. When we talk about the connect part, we're really talking about the relational part. We're talking about building strong, committed, and intentional relationships amongst leaders in the context of a region. When we talk collaborate, we're talking about looking at shared outcomes, not necessarily shared activities. Of course, we will share activities, but first we have to define what we want to change. What do we really want to shift in terms of the social, cultural, and social, spiritual environment. And then thirdly is the celebration, is when we come together and we have these moments of just showcasing kingdom life within the context of the region, and having time to pray and to to just engage God as a collective. And so different regions in the world will start at different points on this continuum. And we just encourage people all over the world not to miss any of the three dimensions. Because if you only have relational connection, well, then it becomes an insular little kumbaya group again, and there's no missional intentionality.
Yep.
If you only have missional intentionality and you don't have strong relationships, well, you're at risk.
Yep.
Because the relationships are really like a bridge
Yep.
over which you want to take the mission. And the stronger the bridge, the stronger the initiative. And you have to have public, prophetic moments where you together celebrate the goodness and the grace of God.
Yeah.
And so those are really the three elements of the framework of functioning in a very broad sense. And sometimes, people would come together and want to more deeply understand the theological, philosophical base for what we are doing, which I also think is very, very important.
Sure.
To have that foundation. And so we encourage that. But in essence, this is what we say to people. Make sure that you cover those three components.
So follow-up question to what you've seen happen around the globe. Could you give me one or two quick stories, testimonies of things you've seen happen in other places, whether it's in Europe or Brazil or wherever you've been?
There's so many stories.
Well, I want to hear like what's God doing?
Well, let me give you one story, and really, it's the fruit of some of the activity that has happened here in South Florida.
Okay.
So here we really kind of crafted this understanding that we want to touch these three dimensions, really talking about faith, love, and hope. So faith touches the spiritual dimension, where we ask the question, what's the lostness of our region?
Yep.
And love touches the pain of our region, the social element of our region, asking, what is the real pain issues of the community that we could actually, if we did it together, effectively address as the church. And then the hope component is the social or the cultural component, that which is systemically broken within society. And so even in this context, we have outcomes in terms of those three dimensions. So we took that template, which is a very simple template, but very profound if it is implemented. And we shared that with the guys in Oslo, Norway.
Okay.
And immediately there was this incredible response. They brought leaders together. There was a group within the city that was helping the church as a think tank called Skaperkraft. And they said, we will take this responsibility to go do research in our city in these three areas.
Okay.
And about a month ago, they had 200 pastors in a room where they actually had a document now where it's published. They talk about the Oslo Monitor, where they now have done research in these three dimensions, showed the church these are the areas that we could get involved in.
Wow.
And at that particular event have rallied around making a difference in these three areas. They now have movements not only in Oslo but in different areas of the nation, which they call movement in the city. Actually, in Norwegian, it's called Bevegbyen. And so now they call every city movement Beveg Oslo or Beveg, Bergen or whatever the city might be. And an incredible movement of God in that nation right now. And I'm going to have the privilege of being back there in 2 weeks' time.
Oh, wow.
To sit down with those leaders and further craft that process. But here's what's really neat. It was deeply influenced by what has happened here
It's awesome.
in the South Florida story.
Yeah.
And that's just one story.
Yeah. Sure.
So many of them. In the UK, amazing things are happening. They've just done research. I think they've found over 600 unity movements in the UK that are now actively starting to function.
So this is so a unity movement would mean every city in
Every
the
city,
UK.
every village, every town.
Wow.
Different, I mean, of course, in the UK, many little towns and villages, right?
Sure.
And so all of those are now starting to emerge with the same dialogue. And they're now harvesting those stories.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, they're coming together, I think, in about 3 weeks' time under the banner of Gather, where they're just harvesting the stories of what God is now doing through the church in these various environments.
So just out of sheer curiosity, who's kind of gathering data that's able to say there's 600 movements happening in the UK? I mean, who's researching this kind of stuff that we know that...
In the UK specifically, it was the Evangelical Alliance,
Okay.
Which has obviously a good macro view of the church within the context of the nation. Perhaps just to say, it's beautiful to see how they work together. There is a group of 6 leaders, actually in the London context, that represents the Church of England, the Catholic Church, the Russian Orthodox Church,
Wow.
or Greek Orthodox rather,
Uh-huh.
the Evangelical Alliance, a group of free churches in the city, and then some of the immigrant churches. And they come together and they formed something they call Together. Together for the Nation. And literally now, when Parliament wants to speak to the church, they speak to these 6 guys.
Really?
When the Crown wants to speak to the church, these are the 6 they speak to.
Wow.
So they represent now
That's amazing.
the church in the UK context.
That's
it's just
awesome.
absolutely amazing
Yeah.
to see what's busy happening.
Yeah. So you think those kind of 3 things that you just touched on in regards to faith, hope, and love, about the different places of brokenness and pain, those are kind of maybe some key ingredients of at least initially drawing people together, you would say?
Yeah. What we say is, for any unity movement to really start, you need 3 things. You first need custodians. You need a group of people that really believe that God has laid this on your heart and that you're gonna carry this responsibility. And that's what we saw here locally. It was just beautiful to see how the pastors of this region have just stepped up to take that responsibility.
Yeah.
They've become the custodians of this process.
Okay.
The second thing you need is cause. You need to be clear in terms of why we do what we do.
Yep.
If you want to have this to be sustainable. And those 3 things that you've just mentioned, the faith, love, and hope framework, has become a very practical, effective framework to rally the cause around. Because we all want to see the faith quotient rise. We want to see the lost being saved. We want to see pain being addressed. And we can do that together as the church.
Yeah.
And then there are certain broken things in our society that needs to be addressed.
Yep.
I mean, here in South Florida, we embraced the educational environment and said, how do we help education? And what can we do in terms of that environment to play a vital role in the areas where we think it might be broken?
Yeah.
And then the third thing you need, so you need the custodians, you need the cause to be clarified, and then you need cash.
That's right.
You actually need money
Sure.
to move this thing ahead. And we are so grateful, for in the initial stage of Church United here in South Florida, we had 4 patrons that subsidized everything we did for the first 3 years.
And these are just individuals that just...
These were, 2 of them were churches.
Okay.
One was a nonprofit. And one was a foundation
Okay, gotcha.
that came together and said, yes, we will fund this for 3 years.
Wow.
Now, just without even, asking for it, the church at large has come into this picture, and churches are now contributing into the church united space. But to give it its initial momentum, it was so wonderful to have these, because we never had to ask for money. We never had to ask anybody for money to do anything that we did. We invited people to go and enjoy and be part of meetings and events and things. And we actually had the money to be able to do that.
Wow, that's awesome. What type of fruit have you seen and do you expect for the kingdom once more of this and there's a little bit more time and it's been stirred around in the pot a little bit longer, and people have kind of acclimated and caught the vision, once it's kind of trickled down past the leaders and a lot of the pastors in the region? What type of fruit do you expect to see? Maybe that's from something that you've seen in another country, or that we just kind of understand biblically what happens when people of God come together. And we know in the Psalms it says that God commands a blessing on unity. And so what type of things do you expect to see?
Well, obviously when you start talking about fruit, you have a view that is a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term kind of posture. And ultimately, if I start with the long term, it's the transformation of a geographical space the size of a city that can align itself primarily to the kingdom of God, and to see the kingdom of God come in every dimension of our community, where it really becomes a place, a preferred place to live. And to serve and to raise your kids, and so the church plays a role within the context, the very fabric of their society. And if we take a longer term view, which we are in the Church United space, if we think 30 years from now, we'd like to see South Florida look very, very different. Both spiritually, socially, culturally. And so we are taking a long-term view. Some of the short-term things that we're seeing is obviously the impact that the church has in certain crisis moments, which we have seen. Just marvelous to have seen that we could be the first responders after the shooting. And that the church was actually there. We showed up. It was the church, not a church. And so many of those are things that we can reference. The church coming together in a Love South Florida kind of banner, where in November the churches together are putting in so much time, energy, resources just to go and love, serve, and bless the community is just absolutely amazing. And if you quantify that just in terms of the value of that, it's quite significant. But in essence, it goes beyond that, because we've realized that if we could have a vision to see things change in the medium term, we said, what if we did put a vision out there and challenged the church in terms of engaging that? And so we have, on the spiritual side, the Barna Research gives us the info that only 3% of this region qualifies, according to their research, to be evangelical, which we would say is committed Christians, right? Living out their faith and believing in the fundamentals of the Christian life.
And would that be attending a service at a gathering, once or twice a month? Is that what they...
No, they did not even test that. It's just about beliefs.
Gotcha.
Just, do you believe the Bible is the inerrant word of God? And has a bearing on my everyday life? Those kind of questions. And so that ultimately brought people from a percentage of in the 40% that would say, yes, I'm a Christian, right down to 3%.
Way down.
And so we said, what if we could move the 3% to 6%, or just double that in the next 5 years? Can you just imagine the force for good if we could just get that right.
Yeah.
And so once we said, let's do that, well, then you reverse engineer and say, so what are we going to do that?
Yep.
And now we've gone back and said, right, so let's start right from evangelism, discipleship, church planting. How do we navigate all of these dimensions and somehow represent just, a better presence of Christ within our region together? And so we've been working hard to see churches become more healthy, leaders become more healthy, them become more missional in their understanding, their communication, their teaching, preaching, them embracing support frameworks like the Alpha outreach program, like, certain discipleship engagements, even thinking through how can we help our people to better integrate faith and work in their life. So all of those conversations are busy happening across the board, across the spectrum of denominations right now. And we're totally convinced that we are going to see 6%.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's exciting. What do you think is unique? I mean, you've been to a lot of places around the world. You've seen different city movements. So specifically, this is really just for you. Why here? I mean, I know you were asked to be here, and there's obviously a God connection, but what is it about here that has some kind of magnetic pull for you to be here and to help engage, to give this part of your life to this particular city movement? Why here rather than somewhere else?
Yeah, very good question. And I'm totally convinced, number one, that God initiated something here that is going to be very, very unique as a point of reference to many others globally. So, obviously there were some providential reasons why we found ourselves here, but I would not have made such a big move if I had not totally believed that this would be something that is going to become a point of reference. And let me say this, already is influencing so many other environments, both nationally and globally. And that's one of the neat things that I, at this stage, enjoy. Whatever we see work here as we together navigate some of our engagement, obviously I become an advocate for that. Other places in the world, you know. So wherever I go, I brag on the South Florida context. Of course, there are other places in the world that we have been privy to that we also know have some elements that have been valuable in our own journey here. And so it's been a reciprocating environment. And so I somehow feel like, sometimes I'm just a kingdom bumblebee, pollinating, various environments with thoughts that we are kind of getting from everywhere,
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. That's a pretty unique job you have, I guess, to be the Christian bumblebee around the world. Well, I think what's cool is that it sounds like at some level that not only have we received some of the wisdom from other places around the world, but then we also get to serve as some level of blueprint for how other people in other regions can do something like this. If somebody's in a region and they said, man, how would I even start to do something or help participate? What would you say would be the first step for something like that to transpire?
Well, as I said, every area is extremely unique.
Sure.
One of the things we had as a advantage to the process here in the Broward or South Florida context was the fact that we already had an organization such as NCF, that
which is National Christian Foundation.
National Christian Foundation, which functions a little more unique than many other places where they are focused primarily as a donor-advised fund in many other places in the nation. Here, under the leadership of Stefan Tchividian, there was this desire to kind of create an ecosystem of not just giving, but also training people to be more effective in their environments, which was where Life Work Leadership was established to help. And they have over 800 alumni in this region alone that have gone through Life Work Leadership over many, many years. So these are people trained to know that life is more than just giving my money, but me also playing a role of living outside of my comfort zone to serve a community. And what completed this kind of framework was the Church United space, where the churches now came and said, all right, so here are the areas where we actually could get involved in, and many of the people in this ecosystem are now excited about the total ecosystem. And that's why I say, you know, when you think about Church United, it did not just start 4 years ago. People have been prepared over many, many years. If I just think about Bob Barnes, that has been pulling leaders together for many years in this region. There were some other guys that we actually found as a small group that were coming together. They called themselves Church United. We actually just adopted that name. And they were coming together to pray for the city. Even NCF was bringing some leaders together to come together. So there were many
there are already
of these
pockets of it.
And so what we saw actually was, in the right time of God, we could actually bring all of this together under this banner, where people had been prepared over many, many years. And so my sense is I would first go and find the people of peace. I would go find like-minded individuals that have been on the same journey, because in every region, God has His people that have been navigating this journey. And then open that conversation and kind of just do a little bit of an asset map to ask the question, you know, do we have enough as custodians to have convening power? Because that is critical. You know, some people have the heart, but they don't have the ability to bring the people together. And so you have to go and ask the question, so who has the convening power in our region? Who will be able to, if they called the key leaders together, that they would show up and sit around the table? And sometimes the people that have the heart do not have that grace upon their lives. And and sometimes they try to do it and then are disappointed because people don't show up. And so you really have to find it. This is all about, you know, really laying down your own ego. And just asking, what's my role in the bigger scheme of things? And finding the right people. And once that convening comes together, I would say I would always start with asking the question, you know, what is the health of the church in our region? It's a good place to start, because if you can invest in that quotient, at least in the initial stages, it sets you up well for any collaborative engagement going forward.
That's awesome. Man, there's so many more questions I've got for you, but I think for time, we need to wrap it up. Are there any last final thoughts that you would have about, about Church United, or about people, pastors walking hand in hand together? I mean, because there are, I would say a majority, it seems like, there's a lot of pastors in the region that are doing things together. There's a few that are not as engaged or haven't really been engaged. Are there maybe a last thought that you would say to just encourage fellow pastors to engage and kind of walk arm in arm with their fellow pastors in their community to help move the needle to up and, to the right in the larger region?
Well, can I shamelessly punt my book?
Do it.
No, I wrote a book called
Okay.
Steady Changes,
Okay.
really with a view to help leaders to better understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay.
So we're trying to answer the why together with the how. But many people have not quite seen the vision, and sometimes leaders just have so much
Sure.
on their plate,
Yep.
and they're so busy. And sometimes it's even a survival thing. I just don't have bandwidth for
Yeah.
anything else. But what I think has been so valuable, and this is why I mentioned the book, is we try to help people understand this is not something you add. This is something you become.
You are. Yeah.
And it's in that process actually where there is a liberation, when you start recognizing that you can make adjustments in your functioning, even as a local church, that would give you more bandwidth.
Yeah.
Because you're now thinking in new ways about your people.
Yep.
You're thinking in new ways about how you're equipping them and what you're doing. So the pressure kind of gets off because you become more missional in your thinking
Yeah.
and what you're celebrating. So you move away from having to create programs to bring more people into. There's a whole philosophy behind this that I
Sure.
think once you get that, it's very, very helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Thanks so much, Alan, for your time. Man, thank you for being a blessing, honestly, to the body of Christ, not only in South Florida, but obviously all over the world. And so all that you've done, it's amazing to see, and to see what God has produced and birthed out of your life. So thank you so much for
Thank you. It's been a joy.
What an amazing interview with Pastor Alan Platt. I could have listened to him speak for so much longer. Man, I was so encouraged to hear about other city movements around the world, about how God is using the blueprint, even in South Florida, to encourage and build other city movements in other cities. I hope that after this whole first season, we all realize that we're on the same team. We are not on separate teams. We're in this together. So I want to encourage you, as we wrap this up, go next door. Go down the street. Go talk to a neighboring pastor, maybe that you've never spoken to before. Go have lunch with them. Go take them out to lunch and say, how can we work together to advance the cause of the kingdom of God? Because we are all on the same team. So don't forget, wherever you are, whatever you are doing, we want to create a movement. We'll see you in season 2.